And I think part of the challenge, Ben, is companies have gone through this in a linear way, starting with ideation, then experimentation and dispersion. When in fact, when you think about value creation, I think you have to start with the value levers. What are the metrics you're trying to shift? Then you have to drop into who owns the last mile and how do you align objectives and outcomes, and how do you ensure that that particular leader, that functional leader, whether it's the chief marketing officer, the chief commercial officer, perhaps it's the product function, perhaps the supply chain leader, how do you ensure that they are fully enabled?
Hey everyone, thanks for listening to The Chief AI Officer. Today I'm speaking with Sanjeevan Bala, who is former Group Chief Data and AI Officer at ITV and a member of several boards. Sanjeevan, thanks so much for chatting with me today.
It's really good to be on board, Ben.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to your views on how AI is reshaping the media industry. I actually just had someone on the show who is a VC in the space that invests in media and technology startups particularly. So I'm glad we can kind of continue that ball rolling. You know, to start with a personal story, what was your first aha moment with AI and how did it shape your career?
Quite a way, quite a while time-wise now. It's sort of back in 2001. And at the time, I was in a company called dunnhumby. And dunnhumby is very synonymous with how they effectively transformed food retailing. So they worked for a company called Tesco in the UK, and they effectively sort of used data across every single aspect of how a food retailer thinks. So from supply chain to in-store, sort of planograms to promotional activity. I think what was interesting about that particular time is, I think dunnhumby really elevated the role of data into the boardroom, and effectively through the work with Tesco, it drove absolute quarter-on-quarter growth for the city and for the shareholder community. And I think that ability to drive that level of value through the use of data and AI, I mean, back then it was machine learning and predictive modeling and some of those things, Ben, was really the big kind of aha moment, because fundamentally, I think it demonstrated potential growth opportunities, how you could innovate business models, and fundamentally how you could diversify revenue streams. And I think that was a real turning point for me in my own personal career.
Yeah, I love that. Also, because you start with machine learning, predictive analytics, as you said, which so many practitioners I speak to on this show always point that out, right? All of the hype right now is around generative, but there are so many ways that AI has been producing such immense business value for such a long time. I mean, looking back and with the perspective of what's going on today, has your view on AI changed or evolved?
I think I'm probably more upbeat and more optimistic, if that makes sense, Ben. And I think I'll tell you why. I think it's moved from sort of a lot of organizations sort of figuring out, and deploying it within their existing sort of environment, their ecosystem, within the supply chain, within sort of both upstream and downstream. But I think that's really coming to sort of this sort of, I guess, this next wave. I think what's really interesting now is the potential for value to be redistributed across a probably quite a stable sort of market vertical. So whether you're in financial services or retail or pharmaceutical, I think that is there's a lot of potential for that to get sort of redistributed. I think the second part to that also is, I think we've gone through quite a period of time where companies have built moats and sort of, defendable sort of USPs. I think a lot of the barriers to that are radically getting changed now, and I think that's going to change the landscape. I also think organizations that had quite a compelling ecosystem play, so whether they were vertically integrated or horizontally integrated, historically had quite a sticky sort of ecosystem they could defend themselves against. And again, it feels like with this capability, a lot of those traditional rules are also going to get rewritten. And I think within that creates a tremendous amount of opportunity.
I agree completely. In fact, I mentioned the VC in the media space that I just had on the show. They were also, her name was Denise Ifar. She was specifically mentioning that AI by itself is not even something they really look for when they think about differentiation and defensibility in a company at all. And so I do think it's having a tremendous impact on the entire value chain. And as you say, how we think about where, which companies are building those moats. Is it changing the way that media companies think about content value and IP monetization?
Absolutely, Ben. So I think if you take a step back perhaps and think about, media and entertainment businesses, fundamentally, what is their value chain? What does it look like, right? So predominantly, for the most part, they're all producing, promoting, distributing, and monetizing content, right? And therefore IP effectively. And so I think with perhaps the recent generative and potentially with agentic AI, what you're then seeing is there's opportunity to impact every part of that value chain, right? So in simple terms, when you're producing content, how might AI generative reduce the cost per production hour effectively, right? So it's a bottom line improvement effectively because you're improving margins. But equally, it's important that not only do you reduce the cost per production hour when you're creating content, but you've got to maintain the same level of quality. So that's an example in the production side where you're going to see a lot of that work, right? And you see it adopted quite materially in post-production, right? So VFX, a lot of those things now, there's a lot of sort of costs you can take out of the business model. When you move over to promoting content, so this is effectively the marketing opportunity, right? This is everything around, how might you increase the number of monthly active users that are coming onto a platform if you're a direct to consumer? Well, critically, how might you reduce the cost to acquire a particular viewer, right? And again, the potential there to reduce those costs, to become more efficient, to attract new audiences, plays quite a material role. Moving on further still, when you're distributing content, and therefore, how do you increase things like dwell time, and how do you increase, for example, your viewing breadth, but against a particular content roster, or your viewing depth? So, do you tend to spend time in one genre or multiple genres? Again, huge opportunity for optimization in that space. And then the last bit, the monetization, gets really interesting, Ben, because what you're seeing there is the opportunity to kind of increase advertising yield. So if you can sell the same ad at a higher CPM, effectively that's pure margin, right? And by doing that and adding other capabilities, you can attract new to TV money. And that's where it gets really interesting for any media and entertainment business. And equally, if you're subscription funded, there's lots of opportunities to kind of optimize the subscription journeys through the product roadmap, product development. So I think it's fair to say, Ben, that every aspect of the media and entertainment value chain has opportunity to be disrupted, critically to create value, both top line growth, but also bottom line benefits for pretty much all media and entertainment companies. So it's a really exciting time to be in the industry.
I love that, especially the very specific KPIs that you're attaching to each part in that value chain. I have two follow-up questions. I guess one, you mentioned the ability to increase kind of what you're charging in terms of CPMs for ads. Can you dig into that a little bit and provide an example of how AI is actually enabling you to increase that? And another thing I want to touch on is agentic, because you mentioned it. How is agentic? Because generative, it's quite clear how it can influence, content creation and production processes, repurposing, distribution. I think the way that machine learning and kind of analyzing user engagement and things like that has pretty clear impact. But agentic is going to be a whole new ball game, and I'd love to understand your views on it.
Yes, if I take the first point, Ben, so a very real example on the advertising side of things. So historically, for background for your audience, media advertising generally has always been sold by genre, for example. So, comedy, for example, or by audience profile. Okay, so ABC1, so it's a demographic composition of an audience, or house person with children, for example. So these are characteristics that have predated, the media industry for a number of years, and that's pretty much how brands and media buyers would buy content advertising, if you will. So one of the things that we developed was there was multiple aspects of AI, really. So we built something that would watch the content, that would then read the subtitles using NLP and natural language processing, and it would then listen to the audio file. And what this could do is it could then identify moments in content where, let's say, coffee was spoken about very, very positively in the first half of an episode. It could then allow us to insert a coffee ad in that first break. And because it was contextually relevant, Ben, it would outperform any of the traditional brand recall metrics that advertisers typically look for when they're running an ad campaign. And it would absolutely perform off the charts. Now, because we had the evidence that it was having a greater impact in terms of brand recall metrics, all of those things, that product, which would be effectively called contextual advertising, would allow us to charge a price premium because effectively it was much better for the advertiser. And that's a really good example where AI was deployed, but it was very much with a value outcome around how do we use it to deploy and drive an increase in advertising yield. And that's one such example where it delivered real top line growth for the organization.
I love that example because we think about context and personalization a lot in digital environments, right? It's very easy to think about how if you visit a blog article or something like that, Google can take that information and then, target display ads or things like that. But I think we think about it a lot less as consumers in terms of contextual advertising on TV. So it's just such a great example of the ways that you can combine those technologies to deliver value, as you're saying. And on the agentic side, how are you seeing that play out in media?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I think where you've got an organization that has historically gone through a lot of M&A activity, for example, and they've either bought up, production companies or bought up a set of capabilities and networks, what you're finding is the post-merger kind of integration aspects typically aren't always completed, right? And so you have different systems, you have a lot of sort of manual patches that sort of try to harness information. I think what agentic does for a lot of organizations now, where we saw things like very rules-based automation. So if you go back in the day, the classic kind of RPA, robotic process automation, I think what the industry saw there is if you had a very prescriptive set of if this, do this, if this, do this, it worked beautifully, right? So things like accounts payables, accounts receivables, chasing outstanding invoices, because it was very rules-based, it was very highly prescriptive. The problem, though, I think, was where something wasn't quite specific, there was some vagary, there was interpretation required, nearly all of those solutions fell over. So very few organizations really saw benefit from RPA. I think with agentic and linking it to your own knowledge base, all of those things, you can give it a task effectively. And because of the way in which it can then interrogate data and find out information, it's then far more optimal to carry out that task with a set of constraints. And that's where the real power comes. So the application of that goes within the organization, right? So when you're trying to drive internal efficiencies around optimizing, let's say, what ad goes in what ad placement, when you're thinking about amortization of content, for example, and how do you think about how that content's being amortized? So there's a number of business processes that exist within media entertainment organizations, as is true with most organizations, where agentic AI, as it's deployed, can create a huge amount of internal efficiencies and allow organizations to redeploy those resources into higher order value. I think what we're seeing at the moment, though, Ben, is we're still at that early stages of agentic in that, yes, you can deploy a particular agent to do a particular task, but actually for the enterprise, the challenge is going to be, well, how do you orchestrate this and manage almost this agent operating system that needs to exist within the enterprise? And what is that going to look like? Because that's a very different OpEx challenge and a very different way of thinking around managing infrastructure, microservices, a lot of these concepts that historically I think the CIO, CTO organization is very used to and familiar with. But I think this tips much more into the business domain around doing a lot of these things.
Yeah, I think there's plenty of VCs that are very excited about that idea of systems of agents operating across the entire enterprise, right? And how do you build multi-agent systems? How do you almost dismantle the legacy systems of ERPs, all of the things that are built up the traditional software categories? And agentic offers a huge opportunity there. Also, some risks, obviously. I think you mentioned the old RPAs and being very rules-based. One thing LLMs do very well is deal with that ambiguity in language, but obviously not as reliable, right? So I think the things that we're going to see in terms of neurosymbolic AI, kind of combining symbolic systems, declarative programming with some of these more like natural language processing things like LLMs, it's going to be very, very exciting to see how businesses unlock value here. Given there's so much in the space, what do you think today is one of the biggest misconceptions about AI, and why do you think it persists?
I think the wider external narrative, perhaps, is this sort of almost overstatement of the potential. And I think for a lot of organizations and enterprises, and in fact consumers, is this perception that there will come a point in time where it can do it all, right? Now, perhaps we will at some point in the time, we will get to the sort of, the pinnacle of all this and AGI becomes more and more capable. But I think that's quite a journey to get there, right? And I think because of that narrative and slightly unhelpful narrative, I think there's a lot of misconceptions around what it can do, even understanding some of the basic foundational elements around hallucination, token sizing. I think a lot of the focus in the industry has been really much around the technology that's enabling. And it feels like the debate and everything needs to flip the other way around actually why are we doing this? What is the business outcome you're trying to achieve? What's the top line growth opportunity or the bottom line margin improvement opportunity? And use that to drive it. I think the second thing, Ben, going back to your agentic point, is I think what's actually going to emerge is very specific, domain specific agentic sort of solutions, because I think the days of those horizontal ERP kind of, enterprise wide horizontal solutions, whilst driving some value, the key to get this next phase right is going to be deep, tacit business domain knowledge. And that sits in the heads of, your functional leaders, right? So to get this to really run, you're going to have to tap into that domain knowledge, which I think very logically then creates, I think, the domain specific sort of agentic kind of future, which then I think gets into a very exciting set of opportunities.
I totally agree. Particularly right now, there's a huge focus on knowledge management, right? Everyone is building retrieval augmented generation systems. But the reality is, sure, you can give it a lot of documents, but that tacit knowledge, so much of the know-how is still locked in people's heads, people that have 25 years of experience within the company. And so I think the companies that figure out how to take that out and kind of merge that with all the knowledge that's in the documents and then combine that with agentic are going to unlock enormous value. And I agree with you. It's going to be happening within verticals because domain specialization is going to be the key there. Shifting back to in the media space, right? Like you've been applying AI across content production, promotion, distribution, monetization. You gave some great examples there. What area surprised you the most in terms of impact or potential?
So I think it's really interesting, the debate in the media landscape at the moment. And I think as generative sort of landed, I think the debate in the industry focused probably very purely on this tooling kind of creating the next sort of big hit, if you will. So the sort of the creative, messy creative aspect of that sort of value chain. But I think when you actually look at it in terms of pragmatic, in real terms, where is the bulk of the costs, if you will, and the activities within the media and entertainment landscape, what you actually find is that in itself isn't by itself the most costly activity, right? As you go through that chain, what you really find is actually there's a lot lower, easier opportunities to go after where it will drive new revenue. So the example I gave around sort of that contextual piece, that was right at the end of the chain, right? Because you create the content, you're promoting it, you're distributing it, you finally get to monetize it. So I think the surprise was actually we almost did this sort of in a good way, if you will, back to front, right? So we looked at the monetization. What are the opportunities there? How does that then drive value? Stepping back from there, the marketing lever, how you might optimize and reduce cost to acquire, how you might increase develop time. And I think that sort of opportunity to kind of go counter to what the industry was saying and where a lot of the energy and the hype was around the end of creativity and, what point is the next, movie going to be generated that's all AI generated. I think that was slightly unhelpful because it became quite a distraction. A lot of creative organizations tried to figure out, well, how is this going to affect creativity? But actually, so much value got generated much later on in that value chain that I was describing. And that probably was a bit of a surprise in that going counter to what the industry was saying, I think was actually a big plus for the organization.
Yeah, I love that. It is true. You would focus so much on that creative aspect, even from a consumer. That's the part that you focus on, right? Because you're consuming the media. If you don't have experience in the space and running the actual business operations, you're not going to be thinking about all that downstream value. But clearly, that's where the value can be unlocked as a business. You sit on a lot of boards, right? What are the conversations in those boardrooms like when you're discussing how to invest in AI today and what your priorities should be?
I think what you're seeing generally is there's probably two sort of opposing discussions that are really necessary. So on the one hand, and these are two extremes, Ben, just to help the audience, I think, is this going to be value destructive for the organization? And that's through the lens of, our competitors that we think about going to enter the market, or more importantly, are there going to be new incumbents and new entrants into the market that we wouldn't even consider as our competitors today, right? And a lot of organizations do this, right? So if you're in telco, you look at the other telcos as your competitor set. So how do you think beyond that mindset and what does that look like? So the most extreme end is the value destruction discussion and debate. And what tends to happen, the center of gravity very quickly goes to audit and risk, right? Because you get into discussion around, well, what are the risks we need to manage against and mitigate against? What are the control environments we need to put in place to manage that risk? How do we set up the right governance frameworks? And that's an important discussion, Ben. What often you don't often see is how do you balance that risk controls discussion because of the fiduciary responsibility of the board with the opportunity. So the other extreme conversation is how might this be value generative and accretive? And what does that discussion and debate need to look like? So boards, I think, are oscillating between those two things, right? And it's important to have both conversations. And I think where they're looking at the opportunity side, what you're finding is how do you then as a board help support the leadership team to construct an approach, a method by which you might evaluate and assess what are the business problems we're trying to face and we're trying to solve? How might this create an opportunity to solve that? How might this capability drive growth? What do we need to enable it? And what's interesting in those conversations, Ben, is so much about how do you enable the last mile? Because what you find is if you don't enable the last mile in the business, all the OPEX or CAPEX investment that an organization might make in infrastructure, technology, people, data scientists, all of these machine learning engineers, all of those skills can be hugely expensive, but no real value getting delivered, right? And I think that's the other conversation that you often hear about. And the conversation often gets to, well, how do we prioritize all the different initiatives? How do we ensure we're doing enough in terms of our capital allocation or expense allocation so that we're constantly horizon scanning and looking forward, but balancing that with risk? And I think that's very much what I'm seeing on across multiple boards, actually.
A lot of chief AI officers I've spoken to on the show stress the change management aspect of this, right? That it's the same conversation that has been going on in digital transformation for a long time. Ultimately, unlocking the value relies on going that final mile and really pushing things through the business. The humans are such a key aspect of that. They can often be overlooked when you're having these very kind of KPI-driven, technology-driven discussions. To get that last mile, right? What are the challenges that businesses face when they're implementing AI within their company to get there?
I think a big part of it, Ben, is they get to that last. And so what I've always advocated is if you're creating value creation plans, you start with the last mile first. And I'll give you some examples, right, Ben? I mean, historically, what you see in a lot of enterprises, right, there's three broad phases, I think, of any new capability. There's the ideation phase, the what if questioning, what if and how might we use this new technology? And that's usually quite easy to do, right, because it's a thought experiment. Then all the companies move from there to the experimentation phase. So you'll hear lots of POCs are running wild. A lot of companies now are describing, proof of cost versus proof of concept, or they're in POC purgatory because there's thousands of these things running, all generating OPEX cost and what's the real value. But they go through this experimentation phase. Then the last phase, probably the most important, is dispersion, right? So how do you then disperse it and scale it across the whole organization? And I think part of the challenge, Ben, is companies have gone through this in a linear way, starting with ideation, then experimentation and dispersion. When in fact, when you think about value creation, I think you have to start with the value levers. What are the metrics you're trying to shift? Then you have to drop into who owns the last mile and how do you align objectives and outcomes? And how do you ensure that that particular leader, that functional leader, whether it's the chief marketing officer, the chief commercial officer, perhaps it's the product function, perhaps the supply chain leader, how do you ensure that they are fully enabled? And that's where you get to everything, Ben, from upskilling those leaders, right? Because a lot of it is just around upskilling the art of the possible. What can it do? What can't it do? How do they understand the risks better? It's upskilling teams within a lot of those areas. And then critically, to your point, it's that change management. And I think the thing with change management I often see in organizations, it's the thing that most projects and programs cut, because it's sometimes the least visible, but it's the bit that's probably the most important and way more important than the technology investment. Because if you don't get that bit right, all that OPEX costs you've incurring doesn't actually fully deliver that last mile value. And this is where you're seeing companies that might have done sort of value maps and therefore have potential value mapped, but the actual delivered value is very, very different. So the question then becomes, well, why is there such a difference? What are the things that are missing? What are the upskilling we didn't do? How do we not sort of upskill and enable that business? I think the other thing you're seeing a lot of, Ben, is, especially when you're introducing some of these capabilities, is how do we ensure that not only are our leaders and the people and talent sort of upskilled, but they've been fully enabled. So often you'll find there's some last mile technology that's missing because a lot of the focus is on the model, the RAG, the number of tokens you can process, the interface into it. I'm not saying they're not important. Those are important discussions. But actually, it's all very well having all this. But if you can't connect that up to the rest of the supply chain, the rest of the ecosystem of the organization through other technology, it's largely an academic theoretical exercise, right? So I think the importance of the last mile, and I'd argue fixing them at last mile first, is probably one of the keys to enterprise large scale adoption and sustaining in this particular era of transformation and change.
That's great. That's a 3-step framework that I know people who listen to this show will love. And the idea of going last first and then working backwards is such a great reframing of how to think about getting value. You said 2 things that also stuck with me. POC purgatory is a great term and a very good description of what I know is going on in a lot of enterprises today. The other thing you said was POC, like proof of cost instead of, proof of value. Can you talk about that a little bit more? What does that mean and how are you measuring it?
Yeah, because I think there's a desire, sometimes the cultural DNA of the organization. There's a real desire to kind of show and demonstrate, right, that you're experimenting in this space. And that's why I think the whole POC psychology kind of kicks in, because you can point at something, you can point at activity that you're trialing, some open source tech or an LLM or something, right? And there's a tangible set of activity you can point at. But I think what you're seeing, though, as companies embark on these things, is these are all quite cost generative, right? And I think that's why I was jokingly calling them kind of proof of cost and POC purgatory. I think the better approach, and this is something what we advocated, is developing proof of value experiments. And the reason that's really important is as you're constructing the experiment, right at the outset, right at the start of the process, you immediately interrogate and get alignment on what is the potential value of this. And the beauty of that, Ben, is it then engages the business stakeholder at the very start of the entire project, the experimentation, right? You then get to overcome and hit any change barriers, any sort of cultural anxieties that might exist, any sort of fear of what's this going to do to my role, all of the sort of things the human-centric aspects that might prevent value being realized, you're going to hit that right at the start before you assemble any technology, LLM or RAG or agentic kind of example, right? And because you're hitting the value question at the start, everything that then follows becomes much easier, right? Because you can either qualify in or out potential at that start point. Either you don't have buy-in, there's skepticism, there's lack of training, all those things you address right at the start. If you do it the other way around, the POC approach, you hit all that much later on. And typically, you don't even hit it at the POC phase, Ben, because you can prove a bit of tech is going to do what it says, right? So can it do this? Yes, it can do it. We've proved it in a POC. You then try and scale it. You then try and scale it at the enterprise. That's when you hit the last mile dispersion problem. By then, you're already all in, right? You've invested cost, you're OPEX scaling, and you don't see the last mile value. So I think you're much better running that right at the outset, because then you hit those really difficult, crunchy problems early, which then gives you much better success rates when you're scaling. And I think the key to all of this is how do you scale this, right? It's easy to do a small trial in marketing. It's much harder to scale in the enterprise. And that's really where the real value is going to come in.
That connects very well with things that 2 guests on this show said. One was Terry Miller, who talked about executive alignment at the beginning being kind of the number one killer of AI implementations most of the time. Like if you don't get that from the outset, you're doomed to fail. And the other one was, I believe, Matt Lewis talking about bringing the detractors as early as possible. The people that might kill a project, the people that have negative feedback or just have opinions about AI that might be obstacles to a deployment, the earlier you can bring them in, the more successful the outcome is likely to be, which I think fits very well with some of the things you just talked about. How do you structure, AI is essentially like running water in a modern organization, right? How are you structuring your data and AI teams to serve the operations effectively?
I don't know if there's a one size fits all for this one, Ben. So I think the way leaders should probably think about this is firstly be very intentional in diagnosing the sort of the DNA of the organization. So what I mean by that is what's its attitude and what are the behaviors you're observing around risk and experimentation? Where is the central gravity of the organization? And to bring this to life, Ben, is in media and entertainment organizations, the creative leadership and the creative teams is really what these businesses are, right? Everything else is there to really support, channel, distribute, monetize that creative seed and that creative kernel. So what that then means is having something centralized in an ivory tower becomes very disconnected, right? Because what you then do is you create this slight culture of dissonance within the organization where this ivory tower looks down upon the rest of the business, right? And that's not helpful at all. So the model we adopted and the one we went with very much was a fully decentralized mesh architecture, though it's not the technology per se, it was more a way of working. We assembled multidisciplinary, multifunctional teams, and we pushed them into the business units. And the reason it was so important, Ben, was we realized that if these teams don't go native and become part of the fabric of the function they go into, there was going to be organ rejection. The second aspect, Ben, that was really critical was everyone in the industry talks about data literacy or digital literacy and digital upskilling the business, and we've got to upskill the business and all this, that, and the other. And that's fine. The bit we invested is on business literacy for these digital teams. Because if they didn't understand the language, the acronyms of marketing, and couldn't speak the language of marketing, they were never going to be accepted into those units, right? So before they were deployed, we did a lot of readiness assessments to really understand, okay, is this digital unit ready? Does it understand the function it's about to go in? Does it understand the language? Can they go native? And that was the key thing. Their identity had to be marketing or commercial or product or creative. It wasn't digital or data or AI, because I think that language is very divisive. And so the model we went down was very much decentralized because it meant that the prioritization would happen in the unit. Often you hear of leaders struggling with prioritization across the business units. Well, that's not a leadership issue in a way, because the reason that comes about is misalignment of objectives. Whereas if you give a capacity model, it's up to those different domains to then prioritize what do they want that unit to work through. The other observation is often the creator of data and the producer of data, the consumer of data, the producer and the consumer, are two different parts of the organization, right? But what this decentralized model allows you to do is it allows those conversations to happen more organically within the business unit versus it going back into the center trying to arbitrage and figure it out and then mandate something. And I think that nuance of the DNA of the organization, the cultural bias around, is it more risk prone, innovation prone, that I think you need to use a lot of that as backdrop to then diagnose what's the optimal model and how do you decide whether you centralize, federate, hub and spoke. I think that's the key thing to it. So I don't think it's a right or wrong. I think it has to fit within the cultural organization and the center of gravity, i.e. the creative heartland. And I think you need to kind of make sure you adhere and replicate that structure in what you put in place.
Yeah, and I love that in that example, you are adopting, at least in this context, it was always business first, right? That's how you're building out and prioritizing
absolutely.
the use cases. So business first is how you're structuring the team, which makes a lot of sense. That's very much an internal view of what's going on within the company. What about going outside, right? Is purchasing AI different from purchasing traditional software?
I think my observation, Ben, has been, I think when you've purchased more traditional SaaS, and be that either vertical SaaS like a MarTech capability or an ad tech capability, certainly my experience has been they often have, reference business outcome proof points, right? So an example might be, a recommendation solution. They'll often talk about this is the sort of lift we've generated when we've deployed this technology to recommend content, as an example, right? So I think in the traditional SaaS purchasing, there's all of those sort of industry-based benchmarks and business-driven outcomes. I think as AI became more prolific and Gen AI, what I've certainly observed is that the conversation is twofold. There's two things happening. One is that the conversation, the USP and everything that's described is very much a technical excellence or a technical differentiator during the selling process. The second thing is I think they're always assuming that the conversation happens between the vendor and the technology department, division, etc. I've always sat in the business. I've not sat in technology. And so what that means is they're relying on the tech function to do the translation in the business and then articulate business value and business benefits, right? And so I think that's the big dissonance I'm seeing at the moment, in that they're entering and they're talking about the technical USP and the competency and the complexity of the models. but they don't have those proof points. And I think it's because they're so used to going in and talking to the CIO, CTO community when they're trying to bring in and introduce the technology. They are then leaving behind or not really force them to think about actually what front end business value does this drive and deliver, because they've not had the conversation with a marketeer, for example, or a commercial leader, or a product function leader, or a supply chain leader, for example, to really translate and understand it. And I think that's the big gap I'm seeing and the big difference I'm seeing at the moment.
Going back to kind of that tension between what you're doing internally, what's kind of external, how do you navigate when you're making decisions about build versus buy, for example? What are the key considerations there?
I think one of the biggest ones is you've got to take a step back and really focus on what are your core competencies as an organization, right? So in simple terms, in media and entertainment, are these content companies that create brilliant content that have technology, or are these technology companies that produce content? Sounds very simple, but that subtle difference can be very material in how these organizations have identified with themselves, how they operate, how they structure, how they allocate capital. So the first part of this is really thinking about what are your set of core competencies as an organization now and in the future? And therefore, depending on those core component parts, does this particular capability give you a differential, sustainable difference that's going to be absolutely important to your core? And if it isn't, then you're definitely the answer is probably going to be more likely a buy, because what you'll see in the market is whilst, a particular model might be more accurate, more better at voice translation or better at image creation, because of the rate of commoditization that's happening in the market, unless that's absolutely core differentiator that you need, that's unique to you, the chances of the rest of the market will sort of come to the same leveling point, right? So that's where I think the build versus buy becomes really critical, because I think there's a time disadvantage in trying to build everything, but there's an opportunity advantage when you're partnering and you're helping to kind of co-create and evolve some of those product roadmaps when you're in the partnering thing. So I don't think the answer is not sort of either or, it's somewhere in the middle. And I think what it really requires organizations to think about is how much of it is core and therefore it's worthwhile us investing because we need that differentiator. How much is non-core, and therefore speed to market and agility and optionality with vendors is going to be more strategically important for us. The only other dimension I'm seeing, Ben, is whether you go for some of these smaller, scrappier, PE-backed funded sort of, incumbent new startups, or do you wait for the more established big tech players to ultimately acquire, assimilate, because chances are big enterprise are already working with them, and therefore wait for them to kind of come on board and acquire the capability. I think that's another philosophical debate around, do you need that capability earlier because it creates a bigger differentiator, or do you wait for a more reliable player and perhaps a bigger, more established big tech vendor to sort of be able to kind of assimilate that capability and then bring that on? Because I think for most organizations, they're going to get AI by stealth. With the existing SaaS providers, they're going to just extend the capability more widely and they'll bake in AI, right? So I think a lot of organizations are going to get it anyway. I think there's a bit of a step back companies need to do. I think about, okay, what is this next trajectory for transformation and value creation opportunities?
Yeah, and you touched on this idea. I mean, it is the fastest depreciating asset in technology history, LLMs, right? So it's just, it will be everywhere, and there will be plenty of opportunities. Because of that, there's also enormous noise in the marketplace, right? You just laid out a framework of maybe de-risk a little bit by just waiting for the integration, waiting for the acquisition to work with a bigger partner. But if you're a small AI startup or even a bigger vendor, how do you stand out in that market and get the attention of a buyer like yourself?
I think the biggest one for me in my observation has been focus less on the technical differentiator that you have. And don't get me wrong, Ben, I know that's important, but don't lead with that, right? Spend a little bit of time understanding the value levers of the enterprise and re-describe what you bring in terms of how it impacts one of those value levers. So effectively, do the hard work and really translate, this is the business benefit we deliver and this is the outcome we deliver. And I think, within that, you often hear this is going to drive productivity benefits, right? I think this is a complete misnomer, right? What most enterprises are seeing at the moment is OpEx cost is going up as they deploy all of these SaaS licenses that are enterprise grade. And whilst there's anecdotal evidence of productivity, like I can write an email quicker, it can summarize a document quicker, you're not seeing any enterprise suddenly having a massive cost out and that efficiency gain happening, right? In fact, what you're hearing from most enterprises, oh no, we've redeployed our people to higher order value work. So this productivity myth, I think, is something, organizations need to be aware of. And I think it all stems from what is the outcome you're trying to achieve. Be really prescriptive on that value case and then map it all the way through there from the last mile enablements and everything through there. Then I think you're starting to pose and address the right questions in the right order, and you have a much greater chance of success.
Comes down to fundamentals, really, right? Like focus on the value you're creating and contextualize that within what matters to that business in particular, right? You can't bring the same value to different companies and expect them to be as excited and to create that pull. And I agree. I saw there's so much data coming out about the inability to map the productivity gains or to really see it within large companies. I think there's a lot of methodological problems there where it's even hard to track. There might be some kind of shadow AI being used within companies a lot, like people logging into GPT. But it will be so key to start to understand where does the value really lie. Looking forward a little bit, do you think that companies today are doing enough when it comes to AI ethics and governance? And what's the biggest blind spot?
Yes, I think this one's really interesting for me. So I think certainly across Europe, the narrative in that space is quite active and live in terms of more broadly. But I think the biggest blind spot is very much around. I think it can come in slightly conceptual, very theoretical is one particular challenge. But the real challenge, I think, for a lot of organizations is all of this has to be linked back to their purpose and their values. Because a lot of companies went through a period of ascribing purpose statements or value statements around what role are they going to play in society beyond profit at all cost type thing. And it feels like that has to be your start point to then determine what position are you going to take with ethics, right? And I think being very candid, a bit like biases, and how we all have our own biases, ethics is another area. There's so many ranges of grey that I think you could argue that everyone is unethical at some point. So therefore, how do you construct frameworks that allow us to really understand that behavioral trait, link it back to that purpose, that alignment against purpose, and then create the frameworks that then can be deployed within the organization? And I think that's the bit that is a bit of a blind spot. I think that's where it comes certainly grappling with sort of some of these ethics principles that are coming in, and certainly the EU AI Act and some of those things, which are guidance, and they're very prescriptive in particular use cases. But it's figuring out, well, how does that really sit against our stated goals and our stated purpose and behaviors that we're looking at organizationally? And I feel those things have to be much more closely interlinked for this to then actually be embedded behaviorally, rather than a set of ethics principle statements and a policy around ethics that sits in somewhere on an intranet, and it's not really embodied and lived and breathed. I think it's that behavioral part that I think you need to really link it through to for this to be a successful strategy.
That last mile, the dispersion element over again. I love that. What's a strong opinion you have about AI that you think many of your peers might disagree with?
I don't necessarily disagree. I think there is an element of, on the one hand, that there's a huge amount of energy and excitement for the potential for new business models to be created, right? And therefore new value streams to be created. And the way in which we think about IP creation and exploitation is fundamentally going to be changing, right? To the point where not only the creator of the IP is going to benefit from it, but also the consumer of that IP potentially can start to benefit from it. So some of the Web3 principles, I think, certainly can't play out. But I think on the other end of the spectrum, I think some of the large scale concerns, which I think are broadly shared, is I think the asymmetric kind of societal benefit that this will drive. And it feels like if you look at sort of earlier on in terms of education and the educational system, it feels like the divide of those that sort of have and know and understand and can exploit and create value versus those that can't and don't, that's going to be massively exaggerated, right? So it feels like there's going to be a very asymmetric kind of landscape societally, which I think will become quite problematic. Now, whether others will agree or disagree, it feels like that's certainly quite polarizing kind of perspectives that I don't think organizations are necessarily looking at, and it's not really their remit. So it then goes up a level for governments, institutions, state-owned enterprises to kind of sort of think about how do we really see this happening and playing through.
Yeah, the digital literacy gap is going to be extremely exacerbated by the AI literacy gap that is going to happen
Yeah,
very quickly. Sanjeevan, I could talk to you forever. This is fantastic. I know we're already over time, so I'm going to wrap it up with our lightning round, keeping it relatively short. I'd love to know, what's the AI tool that you use the most in your daily life?
Anthropic. The reason is for really good at reasoning, or it's good at that reasoning logic and iterative learning.
Nice. Okay, so even more than O1. Have you played around with O1?
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Starts to tinker a little bit. I think what I like is the logical way in which it breaks down the reasoning steps.
That's great. And what's your go-to resource to stay up to date on AI?
Oh, there's three, if you permit me. Firstly, a lot of the strat consulting firms give you a really interesting perspective on the business angle of this, right? And the operating model, some of those things. Second area on the platform infra, A16Z, I find they have really interesting thought pieces around the emerging ecosystem, how to think about platform infra hardware services. And I think that's a good framework to kind of use. And then the last one for the pragmatic side is peer networks, right? So other digital officers, leaders in different companies, different territories, to really figure out and find out what's really happening and go beyond the hype. And I think that critical horizon scanning balanced with absolutely what's really going on is really key at this point in time.
Those are great resources that I'm sure our audience will love. And I really see the through line in so much of our conversation today is so focused on the business, so focused on what is the value that's being created or destroyed in some cases. Sanjeevan, that was amazing. Thank you so much. If our audience wants to connect with you or follow your work, where should they go?
LinkedIn would be the best bet, Ben. Very happy to be connected. I look forward to it.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you so much for joining today and sharing your views with our audience. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.